Yes, of course. Welcome, Leontina. It is great to have you with us. Hoping that the day will come when you will be present here personally, not just online. I know that you have been in Belgrade at some conference of the Byzantologists. How many
Mm-hmm.
years ago?
I'm six now, almost. Too long.
Perfect,
Yeah.
perfect. So it is real time to have you personally here at the Forum Romanum. We have a lot of our American colleagues and friends. I just made a probably mistake. Victor Castellani is not at Wisconsin. I think he is at the Denver. Now I was corrected, but I know well that I had a great colleague from Wisconsin. Now I cannot recollect the name. In any case, we had the contact with your university, and it
Mm,
would be our pleasure to have you here. And
right.
my, of course, great welcome to you. The topic is wonderful, and I'm really happy that we are going to have some small, let's say, overview of the wonderful book that Leontina made about gender in Byzantine period and in Byzantine Empire. So we are going to share with you a part of your knowledge, and for a lot of your knowledge, we have to take the book. I give a word that I will order your book for our library, and
Wonderful.
hoping that when you come, we are going to have some more people who had better insight in your complete work. Welcome, all the best. Feel fine with us. I'm sorry that at some point I have to leave for a dinner, which is a business dinner, unfortunately, but in any case, I will be with you much as I can. Thank you again for coming and feel fine with us. All the best.
Thank you so much. The warm welcome. I do very much look forward to when I can come and see you all in person again. And I'm delighted that you have some interest in my book and in the topic of Byzantine gender. Should I start now or should we? Good moment. Okay, great.
Go
Um,
ahead.
Thanks very much. I appreciate your time. Just before dinner, right now it's just before lunch back in Wisconsin. I'd like today to talk a little bit about my general theory about Byzantine gender, which I wrote in my little book. Okay? Um, and I would like to talk briefly about how that connects with Eastern Roman conceptions of ethics and ethical training. And I would like to take a single example of a how someone in the medieval period, in the 12th century, used people from ancient Greek history as models of ethical behavior. So I want to give you a little bit more depth on how the medieval people used their ancient heritage when it came to constructing conceptions of gender. So as I see it, in the Eastern Roman Empire, gender was conceived as having two major factors. On the one hand, there was your nature. People were born with certain predispositions and certain tendencies based on the physiology of their bodies. So men were supposed to be by nature one particular way. They were medically drier and hotter and stronger, and they were conceived of having more natural control over their emotions and more rationality. And women were by nature soft and wet, according to Galen's medicine, and subject to their emotions. Their emotions controlled them rather than them controlling their emotions. And also irrational and flighty and inconsistent and not steady. So those are natural predispositions that came with bodies. Children were naturally wet and cold like women, and then boys hardened and dried up as they grew up and became men. And then old men could, of course, go back to being more like women. They could get softer and colder. So masculinity is physiologically seen as something that is also on a continuum. But everyone, that's your nature. Everyone was conceived of as an ethical creature who, through habit and determination and training and virtue, could become either a good person or a bad person. You could be a virtuous person or a sinful person. And that was connected with your gender in that To be a good person was to be more like that masculine ideal. You could have more control over your body, over your impulses, over your animalistic tendencies, more control over your emotions. That would be to be more masculine, right? Or men and women could be less of that and cave into their natural impulses, desires for sex and for food and emotional, letting your emotions be in control. Right? So women who are naturally seen as less able to control their emotions and their bodies could, with effort and training and work on their virtue, become more like men. And they're described explicitly in our texts as becoming more masculine, having a manly disposition, having a manly self-control that goes beyond what we expect for her gender. Right? And men could either become very strong in their self-control, or they could go soft, which is considered going womanly. Right? So whole armies are described as fighting like men, and then not being like men, and running away like women. So, and almost every female saint is described as having greater than natural strength of character, right? So they were all exceptions. And in fact, women could always be exceptional. I mentioned that they were seen as by nature as inconsistent and immodest and giving rein to their desire for sex. Everybody's desiring sex. But the norm in medieval Eastern Roman society was for women to be very modest, to have their hair bound back, to be covered, to hold their hands closely, not to move around. Right? So the normal behavior was for them to be very restrained, because that showed their virtue. It showed that they were working on trying to become more like men. Right? And every time a woman would buy property or sell property, so in our legal documents, one of the things that they say they are doing is they are not acting out of womanly simplicity. So when you act in a law court or in a legal sale, you act with a determination to be more like a man and less like a woman. So I see gender as very much a matter of performance, that people try to act your gender. And acting their gender was very closely tied with acting proper ethics. So ethical behavior and gender behavior are very tightly interwoven. And this is obvious in all of our texts. When people talk about men and women as men and women, they're talking about men and women trying to be good as men and women. So to be a good woman was to be good as a woman. To be a good man was to be good as a man. Now, so this is clearly, you can see, there was tremendous interest in maintaining ethical stance and being ethical and virtuous, because that was connected to properly presenting one's gender. When I look at texts from the Eastern Roman Empire, I see people very worried and concerned and acting in such a way as to perform their gender properly. So people worried about it a lot. And I see this as connected to one of the most common characteristics of Eastern Roman culture, which is the patterning of self on classical and biblical models of behavior. If you look at hymns or sermons or short stories or histories or letters or orations, or you go into church and you look at the saints painted on the walls and you look at icons, what you see is texts trying to present past models of behavior for people to imitate. So when elite rhetoricians were learning how to write good texts, one of the things they would do was they would practice speaking in the voice of another. They would write exercises such as, what Hercules would say when he received an oracle from Zeus, or what would the Mother of God say when Christ turned the water into wine? What did she say? So you practice making a speech in that other person's voice. But before you did that, that's an elite practice. Everyone learned how to speak their emotions by reciting the Psalms. The Psalms and the Proverbs and biblical stories and liturgical hymnody was seen as a repertoire of all the emotions you could have. Right? So whatever feeling you had, David sang about that feeling once because he had experienced everything. And you sing the Psalms and you recite the Psalms as a way of expressing yourself and also learning how you should respond to a certain situation. Right? Learning the appropriate motion for that context. Right? And this is pervasive throughout Eastern Roman texts, that people learn to form their character on the basis of biblical models, Psalms especially, and on their classical characters. Right? And when you want to describe who someone was like, what they were like, to talk about a person's character, the most common way to do that is to say they were like particular heroes from the past. Right? So you had the perseverance of Job. Right? He had the constancy of this person. He had the the lawgiver like Moses. Right? And so for every character, there are ways to describe characteristics by talking about past models. Right? And so whether you're talking about saying he's like Alexander the Great or whether he's like David, that's a way of talking about their character. Right? When people try to talk about themselves, they also try to say who they were like in the past. Right? So we have these allusions to previous cultures, right? To ancient Greece, to ancient Rome, to biblical texts, and to past saints and past theologians as sort of a pervasive characteristic of Eastern Roman culture. But how then did it work? You're taking as a model for your ethical action someone from ancient Greece. They would then have very different ethics from the people in the 12th century. And so this is the question that I want to work through with you today. Some research that I'm more recently working on. I don't want to just tell you my book because you can read this, right? I want to give you something more. So I want to take you through an example of a 4th century BCE Spartan general and king, Agesilaus, who is a famous Spartan king. And he shows up in an early 12th century history, a universal history, as a model of ethical action and as a model of a great way to be as a human, which is a bit odd because his own morality, I think, was quite different from that of people in the 12th century. And he's a particularly striking example of someone whose story is odd enough that I actually was able to trace it from the 12th century of the Common Era all the way back to the 4th century of the BC. Right? And so for 16 centuries, Agesilaus' story is an example of sophrosini, which is the virtue of discretion, chastity, sort of moderation. So it's always about sophrosini, but sophrosini's meaning changes over those 16 centuries so that we both have continuity while the world is evolving and changing. Right. So to get to this specific, in the 12th century, right around 1100, a fellow named George Kedronos wrote a universal history. He wrote from creation up into 1057, history of everything, right? Which is basically the history of the Roman Empire. And in his history, he does not include anything about classical Athens. He doesn't talk about Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, all the things that people in our classics departments love to talk about. He leaves all of that out. But when he talks about the reign of Claudius, he goes on a digression about the origins of monasticism. Right? So he tells us that monasticism is not a new thing, but a very ancient Christian practice, and the first monasteries were started by Saint Mark in Egypt. right? And in the course of this digression, he talks about not only people now, for him now, Christians, believe in the antiquity of monasticism and the importance of chastity, but also ancient people. And he says, Agesilaus, desiring a beautiful boy and wanting to kiss him, prevented himself, fleeing from that harm. And Alexander did not dare to look at the extremely good-looking and virgin daughter of Darius, considering it completely shameful and very inappropriate for a man who had conquered men to be captured by a woman. And even Cyrus, the king of the Persians, did not deign to look at the amazingly beautiful girl set aside for him and famous for having irresistible beauty. So this string of anecdotes, Agesilaus, Alexander the Great, and Cyrus, king of the Persians, these are all part of an extended argument for the importance of celibacy. Yet none of them were celibate. So we have every reason to think that King Agesilaus of Sparta would not have understood the argument about celibacy, and certainly he wouldn't have recognized it. And he might have been a little bit unhappy that nothing else that he did was remembered in this history, right? There's nothing about Sparta except that here he is standing up for celibacy and monasticism. Right? So how did this actually happen? The story of Agesilaus turning down a kiss comes from Xenophon, who's the 4th century BC Athenian general and philosopher and historian. And he writes an encomium of Agesilaus. That's the foundational text of the genre of Greek encomia. It's like the first one, and it is copied continuously throughout Eastern Roman history as an example of a beautiful encomia. And he is talking about the sophrosini, the virtue of moderation and self-control that Agesilaus has. So he says Agesilaus was able to withstand cold without complaining, and he didn't need to eat much, and he didn't drink much. And he tells a story about how a beautiful Persian boy was going to come and give him a kiss of greeting in part of the negotiations when he's negotiating with the boy's father about a treaty. And Agesilaus is described as really wanting to kiss him, but says, no, I shouldn't do that. And then he feels bad about it. He says, well, he tells a friend, could you see if he would really try again to kiss me? He said, like, are you sure? Well, no, I don't want to do it. So he turns down this opportunity to kiss this gorgeous Persian boy. And it's used as an example of how strong he was in his sophrosini, his self-control. And then Xenophon is also the origin of our second anecdote about Cyrus and the beautiful girl. And this is in Xenophon's text, The Education of Cyrus, which again was very commonly copied throughout the history of the Eastern Empire. It's also called the Chiropedia or the Cyropedia. I'm sure it's pronounced differently in different cultures. And Panthea is a recurring character. She's the wife of a nobleman, and she becomes captured by Cyrus. And his friend comes and says, you've got to look at this woman. She's so beautiful. And Cyrus says, no, I don't even want to look at her because I might be captured by her beauty and just spend all my time sitting around staring at her. And I've got an empire to run, so I don't want to look at the pretty girl. And her story goes on, but that's enough for now. So these texts were very significant in the history of encomia, right? And then our third story of Alexander not wanting to look at Darius's woman, that occurs in Plutarch. Right? So Plutarch is a 1st century of the Common Era Roman writer writing about Greek ethics. And he's writing in his Life of Alexander, he's modeling this scene in which Cyrus has captured the wife and the mother and the children of the Persian King Darius, but he doesn't want to look at them. He's modeling it on Xenophon's story about Cyrus. Right? So Plutarch is very much engaged in working with Xenophon tell a similar story. And in Plutarch's Life of Alexander, the battle in which he defeats Darius, the Battle of Issus, is really short, and the stories about Alexander's sophrosini, his restraint and self-control, are 3 times as long. So it works out being like the reason why he conquered Darius was because of his strength, of his virtue, right? Rather than the fact that he was militarily better. And in his story, again, he's considering it the mastery of himself more kingly than the conquest of his enemies. Right? Alexander did not lay hands on these women. So it's a story about he doesn't go to see them, and he respects them very much. And it's sort of paired. And then in other of Plutarch's writings, Plutarch was, there's lots I could say about Plutarch, but I'll just say, he uses these pairs in different ways, right? So he makes, in his Life of Alexander, he talks a lot about Alexander's restraint in front of Darius's women. He also writes a Life of Agesilaus, in which he emphasizes his sophrosini very much along the same lines that Xenophon does in the Encomium. So he tells the story of Agesilaus resisting the desirous kiss of the Persian boy in his Life of Agesilaus. Then he has an essay on curiosity, which is about how not to be a busybody. And in that, he explains, he uses the example of Cyrus and of Alexander together, paired, as reasons to have self-control and not to give in to temptation. And then in another one of his essays, the very influential essay on how to study poetry, he also invokes Agesilaus and Cyrus. So he pairs them. Let me give you the quote. In the same manner, this is Plutarch, one who is fond of wine should be on his guard against drunkenness, and he that is amorous against love. So did Agesilaus, who would not to submit to being kissed by the handsome boy who approached him. And so too did Cyrus, who dared not even look at Panthea. So in Plutarch's work, these 3 cases of Agesilaus and Cyrus and Alexander serve as examples of sophrosini in making a resounding case that this control of one's urges is the paramount virtue for a man and for a politician. And he makes this case in a number of different ways. He does not use these stories to advocate that sex is itself bad, but rather that sex needs to be regulated because men need to be in control of themselves. Everyone should be in control of themselves. And Plutarch's project in his parallel lives, which were some of his most widely read texts, he would compare an ancient Greek figure with a classical Roman figure. So someone within the past 100 years of his own history with someone from ancient Greece. And it had the effect, and he would compare them according to a common morality. He would judge them with one moral, ethical system in which this virtue of sophrosini was very, very significant. And it had the effect of bequeathing to later generations a more homogenized view of ancient and classical morality. Right? He had already done much of the work of softening the differences between a figure like Agesilaus and a figure such as Caesar or Anthony. When he's making his paired lives, he's judging them according to a common model of morality. Right? One of the interesting things that's happening in Eastern Roman history now is that we're finding more and more Plutarch. Right? It used to be that people would think, oh, it's medieval, they don't read that much, they don't really know these texts, and they might look for direct quotes. And now we're seeing Plutarch many more places. Right? So it's much more commonly read than we had thought before. But before we get to that, when we're still in antiquity, he was very influential. So the next stop on our story, I think, is Basil of Caesarea, the great church father, who wrote an address to young men on how to read poetry, how to study literature. And that text is very much in dialogue with Plutarch's essay on how to study poetry. They have similar outlooks of a like-minded reading of a like-minded material. So they're very close. And St. Basil uses the story of Alexander, not looking at Darius's wife, to praise self-control. And it's strongly reminiscent of the way that Plutarch deals with this in his life of Alexander. So Basil says, we should not pass by the story of Alexander, who took the daughters of Darius prisoner, and, although they were reported to exhibit an amazing beauty, he did not think it right to look upon them. Rather, he judged it to be a shameful thing for a man who had conquered other men to be defeated by a woman. For this amounts to the same thing as in that saying that the one who has looked upon a woman with pleasure has committed adultery, even if he has not acted. Because he has admitted the desire into his soul, he is guilty of the crime. Okay, so you can see very similar in its take on its use of this ancient story, but with a little bit of a difference, right? Basil is saying that it's sinful to want to desire the beautiful person. Right? That's quite a leap from saying that, it's good to moderate your sexual impulse and control your sexual impulse to, hey, your sexual impulse is bad. So that's a pretty significant step. Then next stop that I could find is in the 5th century, first 4 decades of the 5th century, an Egyptian monastic leader called Isidore of Pelusium. Isidore writes hundreds and hundreds of letters. And he writes them in Greek. And one of his hundreds of letters is a short one, and it's a little essay on the biblical injunction from the Gospel of Matthew. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one limb than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. So Isidore is trying to elucidate this passage. So he starts with sayings of Jesus, and then he does sayings from other books of the Bible, sayings from Proverbs, sayings from the wisdom of Sirach, and then he does theologians. He talks about Athanasius, he talks about Chrysostom, all the great theologians. And then he says, it's also right if we look outside of our tradition, exothen, because even people before Christ believed in Sophrosine. And then he tells our 3 stories about Agesilaus and Alexander and Cyrus in very much the same form that they appear in George Kedronis's text in the 12th century. So here we have an actual, it's pretty clear they're looking at the same text. It's not just a story, but you're looking at a document that has particular words, though there are changes. So he tells the story of Agesilaus not looking at the Persian boy and Alexander not looking at Darius. And then he says that not only the Hellenes, not only the Greeks, but even the barbarians provide examples. And then he tells the story of Cyrus not looking at Panthea. And then he winds up by saying, all right, if this advice comes from Gospels and Proverbs and wisdom and Hellenes and Persians, you really ought to take it. So go forth and don't look at tempting things. And I think that Isidore is able to do this because these texts had already been pulled together. Agesilaus, Cyrus, and Alexander had already become a triad in the work of Plutarch, and they had already been homogenized in the morality. So although Basil is changing the structure, he's saying that it's not just moderation, but sex itself is bad. There's not that much space between Plutarch and Basil. That's a slight shift on a basically a common reading of them as important because of their self-control. Now, when Isidore puts these people in his letter, it's very quick. He just talks about the boy, and you don't have to describe the beautiful Persian boy. And he talks about, Darius's women, only giving them like a definite article, no descriptors. And it's assumed his readers knew the stories. Right? Clearly, he's expecting his audience to know, oh yeah, Agesilaus and the beautiful Persian boy. Okay, that's enough. The next stop, all right, we have this, is in George the Monk, who is a 9th century Eastern Roman historian. So he writes a history that begins in creation and it goes to 843. And George the Monk's history is a huge, long compilation. It's chronological. It starts with Adam and it goes up to the current emperor, and has lots of digressions. So it's been called a short story compendium. Lots of moralizing tales. Again, Sparta does not appear at all. Agesilaus is not in there and having anything to do with the Peloponnesus or any of his actual adventures. But he has this digression, a long digression, 26 pages, placed in the reign of Claudius on the origins of monasticism. And this digression on monasticism begins with an introduction that says, now I need to tell you about the origins of monasticism. And I've put together these phrases coming from many, and I'll give you the quote. I think this might be a freestanding essay. There's no way to prove it, but I think it might be an earlier essay that responds to iconoclasm, because it opens with this. I put together these few statements, selecting them from many, thinking it necessary, on account of all those questioning when, where, and wherefore the monastic way of life started. How now? How do the icon fighters, following the new and recent doctrines of the impious and God-hating crap-named mystagogue, in the height of mania, insanity, and depravity, how are they now impiously and nonsensically rejecting and spitting on the monastic polity and the other divine institutions and traditions? Right? And on and on. So this vehement, overblown hatred of the icon fighters indicates that this might have been written either in the reign of Constantine V, who ruled from 741 to 775, and is known as the great iconoclast emperor. He's called the Capronimos, so he's the crap-named mystagogue as Constantine. It doesn't prove that it was written in his era, because he's known as the crap-named mystagogue who tried to fight monasticism for centuries afterwards. So it's at least mid-8th century, right? But possibly 9th century. It could also be something that we don't know. George the Monk might have written it himself as part of his history, but it's possibly a freestanding essay. Right? So the purpose of this essay is not to warn people off of looking at tempting things, but to argue that monasticism is old and celibacy has been a virtue for forever, right? So he makes pages and pages of patristic quotations, lots of Nilus, lots of Basil of Caesarea, lots of Chrysostom, Gregory Nazianzus, on. And then he says, look, and there's other things. There's Socrates and Plato. So many quotations from Socrates that arise from Platonic dialogues. Then he also says, it's not only Socrates and Plato and the other Hellenes abhorred an unjust life, but many barbarians. And then he talks to the Hyperboreans, the Brahmins in India, the Scythians, right? And Chiron the centaur. Chiron the centaur? Yes. He loved just life and was celibate and argued for celibacy, according to this text. Right? And then he gives more quotations from Plato. And then it's Agesilaus and Alexander and Cyrus and their stories. Now, within this text, there's lots and lots of Plato, but it doesn't come, everything that's Plato that's in this text is also in Theodoret of Cyrus's book on the cure for the Greek maladies, which is a 5th century attempt to use philosophy to prove Christianity. It's making a very different argument, and so it's not as if it's quotations from that, but whoever wrote this essay on monasticism used Theodoret of Cyrus as a source book, as a reader on Plato, and plucked out every time when Socrates is talking about virtue. And Socrates talks a lot about virtue. Right? So if you're looking for phrases in which Socrates says virtue is good, right, there are plenty of that. He didn't believe that celibacy was good, but in any case, that's what it's put to. Right? Now, it's clear that the Greek is close enough that George is obviously, or whoever wrote this digression, is using Isidore's text. They have it. And it's an interesting way, if you're interested in changes from late antique Greek to medieval Greek, you can see them, they change the participles, they adjust the verbs just slightly. He also puts in a few more words, right? So he talks about, right, whereas Isidore just said, Agesilaus, seeing the boy, prevented himself and fled the harm. In George the Monk's history, it's Agesilaus, desiring a beautiful boy and wanting to kiss him, prevented himself fleeing the harm. It's more few words. He calls, instead of Darius's woman, it's Darius's extremely good-looking and virgin daughter. Right? He calls Panthea, it also expands, he takes out her proper name, right? So that's a detail. People don't know who Panthea is, so that gets out. And he calls her a Kori, which is a girl, right, where she's actually a married woman in the story. And the other change, most of the manuscripts of George the Monk, they don't quite get Agesilaus's name right. They call him Gisthilus, they call him Yseleus, Archesilaus, right? So it's clear that they're preserving this name. They don't really know who this guy is. Some of them do. And he also, they changed the distinction, whereas Isidore is talking about, there's the Hellenes and the barbarians, right? In George history, it's the Christians and everybody before then is the distinction. Right. So this is the point of this digression is that celibacy is great, right? And celibacy is good, and all of these people support monastic celibacy and strength. Okay? And then last stop is around 1100. We're back to George Kedronos, who also wrote a universal history that starts with creation and follows the Roman Empire up until his current era in the middle 11th century. And he uses George the Monk's history as one of his sources. He uses a bunch of other things. He's he copies Scilitzi's history completely from the 9th through the 11th centuries. So it's another major compendium of Eastern Roman history. So when he gets this digression, he leaves it in. It's still the reign of Claudius. It's still St. Mark has founded monasticism. But he's really bored with all of the Chrysostom and the Basil and the Gregory Nazianzus. So he puts in 2 paragraphs, a little bit, and then he says, many other holy and blessed men attest to the antiquity of monasticism, variety of texts. No one should complain if we introduce some witnesses from the outside, from the exothen. Then he keeps all of the stuff that's from Socrates and Plato. He keeps Chiron the Centaur, and he keeps Agesilaus and Alexander and Cyrus. And then he gives one more paragraph of Athanasius, and then he's done. So this thing used to, in George the Monk, it's 26 pages long. It's almost all patristics. It's got a little bit of classical stuff. In George Kedronos, basically he has Chiron the Centaur and Agesilaus doing all of the heavy lifting without any help. Right? It's got a few paragraphs. And of his patristic paragraphs, he selected out the ones that say, all right, it's best to be a monk, but being married's really okay. Right? So he has Athanasius and Basil of Caesarea basically, yeah, marriage is fine if you can't handle being a monk. Right? So his digression is really quite different because it's, yeah, marriage is fine if you can't be a monk, on bookending the 5 pages of ancient witnesses to how great it is to be celibate. It's a very different kind of text. And Kedronos, whose manuscripts are early 12th century, they get Agesilaus's name right. The text of that story, the wording is not different much at all from between George the Monk and Kedronos, but the manuscript tradition has it much more clear that Agesilaus is someone they know, and that makes sense because in the 12th century, we have many more manuscripts of Plutarch. We know that the classical learning is much more prevalent. So the number of people who actually would have been reading about Agesilaus in Xenophon's Encomium right, who would have been reading Plutarch's Life of Agesilaus, has increased tremendously. Right? So people know this. But when they're approaching Plutarch's Life of Agesilaus or Xenophon's Encomium, they're doing it through this heritage of already having fit these fellows into a Christian conception of moral history. So the way that Kedronos is able to seamlessly use them to support a Christian morality of the 12th century is the background in which I think we should be thinking about how Eastern Romans of the 11th and 12th centuries read their Plutarch, read their Xenophon. They see this work Sophrosini, which is a dearly held important virtue in their society, and they see it as really important to Xenophon. They see it as really important to Plutarch too. So Plutarch's teachings had already become part of a Christian ethical system that wanted self-control to be deployed in a service of a strict sexual continence. So far, I haven't talked at all about what importance might have been attached to the fact that Agesilaus had the strength of character not to kiss a boy. But since he's valorous and great because he didn't do it, the valorization of that choice is compatible whether the ethical stance of the community says that it's all right for men to be erotically attracted to other men or not. So in Agesilaus's own era, it was perfectly normal for someone of his station to be erotically attracted to boys. That was absolutely fine. In the turn that criminalized homoerotic attraction happened in the early Christian period, along with this turn in which sex became bad. Right? So when Plutarch was writing these stories, what mattered was the regulation of this desire. That it wasn't that Agesilaus was wrong to want to kiss the boy, right? But it would have been a bad choice because he would have distracted him from his political duties at the moment, right? It would have been a distraction and a lack of focus on what he's supposed to do as a leader, right? And that's why self-control is really important. But you can see how that story, he didn't do it, so that still works later as certain elements in society, legal emperors were trying to criminalize homoerotic sexual acts. Right? And the story in the medieval Roman Empire is not a straightforward story of repression. There's considerable back and forth, and but at every stage, regardless of the stance of the particular text or textual community, you can praise Agesilaus for having the strength not to do this. Right? And no one ever feigned any confusion about why. So throughout the empire, no one was saying like, oh, why would he want to kiss a boy? Which in certain other eras, that would be considered so gross or so strange or so bizarre that it would be weird, right? And that's not the case in the Eastern Empire. So that's sort of my long, quick story, 16 centuries. How 12th century Romans could use a 4th century BCE polytheist who openly expressed sexual desire for young man as a moral exemplar, right? Because despite bumps and adjustments, there was fundamentally a huge amount of ethical continuity in the Eastern Mediterranean culture, right? And George Kedronos, he could read the story of Agesilaus refusing the kiss in either George the Monk's history or in Xenophon or in Plutarch, and he would draw the same moral lesson with which he agreed, which is that Sophrosini is really important, right? So as much as the stern anti-sex moralizing of George the Monk differed from the ethics espoused by Xenophon and Plutarch, in their admiration for Agesilaus's restraint, they were exactly in agreement. So when we think about the mechanics of the cultural transmission, it's easy to say, oh, the Eastern Romans were a classicizing civilization. Right? Let's actually look at how particularly did they do it. So we can see in this story, through the copying of one particular bit of text back and forth, the tradition, all the way back to the ancient world, don't lose sight of the fact that at any point, intellectuals in Constantinople would also be able to read Plutarch and Xenophon, right? So the story passes through this sort of odd bumping around the Eastern Mediterranean set of texts. But we have all of Plutarch and we have everything that Xenophon wrote because these people liked it, right? They copied it and they kept it. And I think that for many of the people who in the medieval era would have heard George the Monk's history, listened to that history, a lot of them would not have known who Agesilaus was, right? Like the copyists who called him Gisthilus, right? But they still would have understood that some important ancient man had the strength of character not to kiss a boy, and that was good, right? So the ethical lesson is fine, even if you don't get exactly who he is. Right? And those who'd studied more would know the story from Xenophon and would have understood it in much more. I'm just skip that part. So I think more highly educated people in the Eastern Roman Empire the more education you have, the easier it would be to see, well, this is the morality of Xenophon, and this is the morality of Plato, and this is the morality of Plutarch. They certainly could do that, right? But the drawing of fine distinctions in different eras is something that the modern academy does. It's what we do as scholars, right? We think of the Psalms, it's a theologically diverse anthology of poetry that was written over 500 years, right? To Eastern Romans, all the Psalms were written by David. Our scholars, our classicists, they'll see total hundreds of years between the Iliad and the Odyssey. Right? These are totally different texts, totally different moral systems, very, very different, right? They're all one blind poet to the Eastern Romans. Right? So it's our cultural habit as scholars to draw distinctions and show how this is different. So we're going to say that the Psalms is different from Plutarch, is different from Herodotus, different from the wisdom of Sirach or Procopius or the life of Anthony. All these things are different. As I see it, to the Eastern Romans from at least the 9th century on, all of these texts were parts of a prized ancient heritage. And there's very little evidence for further distinctions of time and place, right? Just as with the Septuagint, right, we can see it as a diverse anthology of texts written over hundreds of years, right? But it's all still the Bible, and it's used as a homogeneous text very often in many cultures, right? So too, for the Eastern Romans, our classical texts, Plato and Xenophon and Plutarch and Herodotus and Thucydides, it's all classical stuff. It's all exothen ancient people. So while the later Roman intellectuals could see these differences, their imitative habit, this habit I started with, that you form your character by imitating other people, anybody in this huge grab bag, this big gumbo of ancient and biblical texts, was your repository of people that you could hold up as models for how you should live and how you should be. And I think this process of weaving together a classical canon seems to have been well on its way by the time we get to Isidore of Pelusium. Right? By the time we get to the 6th century, Plutarch has done the heavy lifting of making the classical texts something that can conform with a Christian worldview. So I think, in sum, that the classical Greek figures like Agesilaus were able to serve as ethical examples, because for all the differences, the continuity in these cultures is absolutely stunning. And I'll stop talking and take your questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting, and I'm sure there will be questions. So if you have any, please, you can just turn on your microphone and ask something. If you can turn your camera on too as well, that's wonderful. Or you can raise your hands in the app, or if you're not able to speak for whatever reason, you can type your question in the chat. We have a question from Isidora Smolovic. Isidora, go ahead.
Good evening. I have a question in relation of gender and sex. Actually, I want to ask, did gender and sex have to be correlated? And in relation to that, women could change of their performance, emotional, change how they were perceived, but could they change their appearance somehow to like grow a beard and then be considered a male if gender was a spectrum? And also I wanted to ask, in consideration with Basil and Isidore, were men who were considered sinners considered lesser men since they had no control and they were more like women? So if there was no gender, if it was just a social construct, were they actually women in the eyes of other people? I'm not sure if you understood.
Yeah, I get it. It's quite common to describe women as manly when they are exercising virtue, right? So some of the most common words for describing women are actually saying they acted with masculine strength and manliness. There are heroic, unusual saints, right, who had such strength that they passed as men, right? So, you know, the hagiographies, there are several very famous. Mary of Egypt is the most famous, but there are a number where they were, people thought they were men for 20 years and only revealed on their deathbed when their bodies being washed that they're actually women, right? So the body remains woman, but they are seen as men. They pass as men. Right? When men sin through the lapse of control over themselves, they are described as womanly. They're described as being feminized. Do they completely become women and so that they can nurse and give birth to babies? No, right? No, they're, you know, but are they emasculated? Yes. Right? And it's an interesting way in which, even in late antiquity, in the 4th century, bishops who are celibate are claiming a greater strength of masculinity and a greater degree of masculinity to married aristocratic men because they have the strength of character not to have sex, right? So it's Kate Cooper has an article, it's old now, on why is it that so many patristic theologians mention the wives of the aristocratic people that they're writing letters to. And there's sort of there's a, you know, a second wave feminist line of historiography that said, oh, the early Christian fathers were really feminist because they're always talking about women. Look, they're mentioning the women. She says, well, actually, they're mentioning the women as sort of a tease. You know, it's like, you've got a wife, you know, like, I'm so strong, I don't have a wife, but you've got a wife. That's good for you. Okay, I know you can't really handle it the way I am, but you've got a wife, right? So there's a definite, you know, there's a hierarchy of masculinity in which they're trying to claim the strength. Now, we don't know if the people who got the letters took it that way. They might have said, yeah, you're celibate, I've got the wife, I'm the real man, right? All of this stuff is contested. But it's pretty consistent that giving into anger and rashness is feminized, right? So that's a lapse of masculinity. Also in this regard, when people were made eunuchs, right, that is a control over even the physiological aspects of gender, right? So in a society that as I think does construct gender as something that for which people had those realms of control, right? When an adult eunuch goes to the doctor is going to give him the diet that you would give to a woman, right? Because he doesn't have that strength and the dryness and the rest of it. So I think ancient and medieval gender is very different from modern gender, right? So when people talk about now is gender a construct, is gender, is sex biologically determined, right? That's our conversation for us. But when we look at the medieval Romans, They did have, I think, clearly an interplay. You had a body, and your body came with natural propensities, right? And so you had a woman's body meant that you were not expected to be particularly rational, right? But you could be rational if you really worked at it and if you tried hard, or not. So I hope that answers that question a little.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. We have a question from Angela.
I want to say that this speech was really useful, and I hope that I will read your book soon, because it was really interesting information, and I liked it. That because we study about Byzantine right now, so that was so interesting. So my question is: did Byzantine affect some other societies to look at genders just like Byzantine, and that these relationships and connection between genders in past affect today's relationships and look on today's relationships?
So if I understand it, you're wondering if I can draw on my research to speak to modern ideas about gender.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think blessedly things are different. I think that I think I study a pretty profoundly misogynistic culture in attributing, virtue as an aspect of masculinity, and that when women need to be virtuous, they need to be more like men. I think that I don't see that in terms of ways in which women are able to act with authority and power. So moving slightly from the realm of constructions of virtue to actually getting stuff done. Some of the strategies for empowerment that I see active in the Eastern Roman Empire are reminiscent of things that still happen, right? And that what I mean is, I see this is, if you look at Eastern Roman history, there were women who served as empress, there were women who owned property, there were women who owned factories, mills, businesses, and in various ways conducting legal business, acting with more power and authority than you'd expect, given the ostensible structures of this culture. And I see them doing it in one of two ways. First, when a woman is in distress, it's the responsibility of the men around to help her do something, right? So the, help me, help me, help me, means that the guys have got to help her or they're not good men, right? So the men have to step up and give her some help, otherwise they lose their masculinity because they can't provide, right? So can you help her or not, right? What's it going to be? And so I see women, I think that's how the empresses did it. Theodora, who's the 9th century empress, had a coalition of men that she just, like, she doesn't say anything. This is Theophilus's wife. She has these portrayed as an extremely passive person, and she needs help. And then the men come, her generals help her. And so she says, you could help me by go invading Bulgaria, and you could help me by, running the taxes. And, so she's basically telling everybody what to do, and she's ordering it like an empress, but she's like, please help me go fight the Bulgarians, right? So that's one, and it also helps because it's, a man couldn't be a good man and be a servant of a woman. You can't be subordinate to a woman, but you can help one out. And she's not so obnoxious if she's humble, right? So if she's humble, if she's crying and misery and needs help, then she's not obnoxious. She's not fighting so much against those strictures, right? So that's one strategy. And then the other strategy is just to be exceptional. Like, I know, women aren't rational, but I can try really hard and I can do this, like this saint, right? I can transcend. And if you think about the legal documents in which every sale that a woman makes, she says, you have to say, I'm not being tricked, I'm not subject to fraud, I'm doing this of my own free will, I'm not doing it like a silly woman. Right? Everyone who sold something who is female said, I'm not acting like a woman. Right? Clearly, not acting like a woman was an option that women had. Right? So, which both, and this is Susan Harvey pointed this out with the saints, like, it's got to be 25, 30 years ago, that when every female saint is the exception, that both upholds the fundamental misogynistic view, right? Everyone who says, yes, she was exceptionally masculine, that reinforces the idea that by nature, women don't have the strength of character to control themselves, but this one did as an exception. So I see lots of women being exceptions. And so when we think about those two, I think it's fair to sometimes say that women get others to help them by saying, oh, help me, please, the helpless person asking for help. And the humbling discourse, which if you read my book on Anna Komnene, this one, Anna Komnene, who wrote the Alexiad, she wrote a history of her father in the 12th century. So that's a very masculine action to write a history, because you're judging men's deeds, right? And so it's very self-aggrandizing, this culture, for her to say that she has the strength of character to write a history. And she frames her history with lamentation and a piteous discourse about how sad she is and how miserable she is. That's humbling, right? So it makes her seem very small, very humble, very miserable. And that makes it less obnoxious for her to say, well, actually, now I'm going to write like a man, and I am going to judge men's deeds. Right? So she both does authorizing discourses. She says, well, I've read ancient Greek philosophy, and you can tell from my prose that I've read all the ancient classics, and I'm quoting Sophocles and Euripides and all this stuff. So she validates her skills, right? And every time she has a validating statement, she has a woe is me lamentation statement to sort of offset, right? To offset that balance. And so that fear of being self-aggrandizing, I think, is still pretty clear in academic circles. When someone did a study, it's now about 5 years old, of within American universities, of why it is that men have more citations than women now that we have in the sciences. So this is like hard science. Proportionally, and the answer is that the men cite themselves, right? So the women think that it's embarrassing, and they don't want to look like they don't want to stand up and say, like, oh, I'm so great, oh, read me, I'm fabulous, right? They want to do that, so they don't cite themselves. Whereas for the men, like, I'm the authority on this subject, read everything I've ever written. That's the whole of the difference, right, in why the men have more citations than the women. And that's like, that came out in like 2010 in the United States, which is a pretty progressive place. So that's a long answer, but that's where I see it still. Was that helpful?
Thank you.
So you'll notice I have a bibliography. If any of you want it, I can email you a bibliography. I put all of my own stuff on it, right? Because I'm trying. I say, I know Byzantine gender. Here's what I wrote. But
I'm sure some people will find it useful. Do we have more questions? I might have a few if nobody is actively asking. So I'm going to start with something close to your lecture and then progressively go further. I have 3 questions. I'll try not to overdo it. My first question is regarding this new part of your research that I wasn't previously acquainted with, all these variations in the use of classical examples in various writers' works. And the question is essentially, do you think the difference in how they use those examples is mainly the difference in their own views, or a consequence of the fact that they were writing for a different audience?
Mhm.
Do you want me to ask all the questions right away, or?
We can take them one at a time.
Okay.
I think it's difficult to separate their views from the cultural context in which they were writing, and they were trying to argue for a point, but argue for a point within a culture. So I think classicists have spent a lot of time comparing Xenophon and Plutarch, and they see, big differences, but also that Plutarch is trying to comment on Xenophon. He wrote so much and was so highly prized that I think he sort of becomes normative in a certain way. And so that later people are trying to write, expressing their viewpoint honestly, and making a point. I think Isidore's essay is a beautiful short little essay, and he's definitely using these people, deploying them to make the point that he's making. I think that whoever wrote the essay on monasticism is a little bit like a magpie, picking from here and there and putting it all together and sort of shifting it slightly. And then George Kedros used that and shifted slightly again. So I would say when people are using the text, they're redeploying the text to make the point that they want to make. But I find it very interesting how you can basically use the same story and make the point for your culture, so that the change, I mean, Agesilaus would never understand what George Kedros is trying to make him say, right? But it's the same story. It goes to all the way along. Is that helpful? That's the answer I have.
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Now, my second question is more of a plea for you to tell us something that you've written about in your book that I think will be very interesting to our audience here,
Mhm.
and that's the difference in the conceptions of gender and particularly masculinity between the East and West, and how the Westerners and Crusaders saw Eastern Roman men and vice versa. If you could just give us a
Sure.
brief overview of that, I think that's a very interesting thing.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the criticisms that the people in the East had for the Western men was that they were very rash and they got angry and they would rush in, which in Western Europe, if you think about 11th and 12th century, that's an expression of martial courage, that you charge forward into the fray and that you run to battle and that you sort of rush to take up arms. Those were things that within Western European culture would be seen as that's bravery, that's strength, that's goodness. But within Eastern Roman culture, that's acting like women because you're not being deliberate and thoughtful, right? So there's not a lot of that. So one of the most consistent criticisms of the Crusaders is for their lack of masculinity because they were rushing around like girls, the way they thought that women were supposed to rush around. And within the Eastern Empire, to give a sort of a social and economic explanation as well, strength of character was very important because masculinity was not expressed through direct domination of territory. Right? So in Western Europe, you'd be count or king or duke or knight of your land, right? And you showed your strength by dominating other people, right? And in the East, everyone was citizens of the empire, right? So it's a much more civilian culture. And they continued to employ late Roman, by which I mean between the 2nd and 3rd, 4th centuries, there were shifts in Roman masculinity brought on by the fact that you could no longer have the option of conquering a new province of the Roman Empire. right? And as you shifted from being a republic in which there was a multiplicity of political leadership to being an empire, which you had an emperor, and everyone really needed to obey the emperor, there were shifts in Roman masculinity, which created a valorized civilian model, right? And this civilian model of masculinity, which had to do with control of oneself and one's household, and one's personal relationships, right? So it's an expression of masculine strength, but it's masculine strength in this sophrosini stuff, right? That you're going to have control over your body and you're going to regulate your household, and that's what your masculinity was. You didn't need to run around with a sword and bash people over the head to show your masculinity, because that's not just part of it. That's what you hire soldiers for that. Right? And you could be a martial person, but that wasn't necessarily part of it. Right? This, I think that very much pertains. It's pretty radically understudied in that I think if we had people attuned to masculinity, read through our 11th, 12th, 13th century histories, we'll learn a lot more about those ideas. Right? There were certainly some civilian people who were always going to be saying, I don't need to wave a sword around to be a real man. But there were also military men who said, yeah, I have sophrosini and I wave a sword around. And they're more masculine yet. And I think that's pretty understudied. Within scholarship on Byzantine gender, almost all people say gender, what they really mean is history of women. Right? So that people are aware, I do women's history now, I didn't know I do gender history. And people will say things like, oh, I need a gender chapter. And you ask them what they're talking about. Like, no, you're actually just talking about women. Right? And that's good. Talk about the women. But women's history is different from gender history, which is about how conceptions of what men and women were like. Right? And so that ignores the whole field of how masculinity was constructed and how masculine virtue worked. So I think as we do more of that, it's really very interesting, and we will learn more. So I think, like, my current answer is that civilian models of virtue remained options, but martial masculine virtue was something that was also prized in different places and eras, and that I would put it much more contextual, right? So that certain authors in certain places in certain texts are going to be more engaged in martial masculinity than others. But certainly that civilian virtue was completely unknown to the Crusaders, right? Who also took to the Crusaders, one showed one's masculinity by participation in feudal hierarchy, where your loyalty to your lord is a really important aspect of being a good man. So people in the Eastern Roman Empire, your loyalty was to the Roman Empire. It wasn't to the particular emperor. And if a particular emperor started to mess it up, you killed him and got another one, right? So there's a constant turnover in the top job. Very different from Western Europe, and how quickly you can get rid of a bad emperor and get a new one, because the emperor doesn't particularly matter. It's the empire, right? It's the political state that was so important to be loyal to that. And your loyalty could be shown by cashiering someone who wasn't any good. That really shocked the Crusaders, right? And they thought all these people, they thought they were not proper men and not proper people, because particularly just prior to the sack of Constantinople, they murdered the bad emperor. Whereas for the Romans, yeah, he's screwing up. He's got this huge army of Venetians outside the gates about to conquer us. Just it's our moral duty as good Romans to get rid of them. So that's another thing where and you see how gender and virtue are so tightly tied up, right? So is this being a good person, or is it being a good man? And those things are pretty tight. But I would love it if someone wanted to study more on that. If someone wanted to come and help understand medieval masculinity and martial virtue, that'd be great. So in the book, you notice the chapter on women is really long and full and thick, and it's got all these neat ideas, which I've kind of spoken of. And then the chapters on men is like, well, I think this, but maybe not. And I think this, but maybe not. And no one's looked at this. And here are 12 questions that are really interesting, and I don't know, no idea. And it's not because it's unknowable, right? It's because no one's done the work yet. So I hope to get to rewrite that one in a decade or so.
Hopefully you'll have a chance for a later edition to extend that chapter. We have another question from Angela.
Yes, I have one more question. I want to ask, do you think that men used some norms from Bible or generally religion to put power on women? Because when we talk today about some things, for example, rape, people, or no rape, abortion, a lot of people will be like, it seems, if we look Bible, it seems, but they don't look about some other things. So do you think that they used in past some norms from religion to put power on women?
Absolutely, absolutely. If you read in the book of Proverbs, there are lots of stories about blessed is the man who has a wife who stays at home and does this. And, woe to the man whose wife does this. And good women and good men. And it's very patriarchal. And the message is that women need to be demure and fertile and stay home. There's considerable support from that. And those texts were used really frequently, right? So when I'm talking about this imitative habit that they were constructing their society and their sense of virtue in response and in imitation of these ancient biblical models, that means that the models for doing things that are in the Bible are ones that they are using very frequently. And some people would say, ages ago, people would say, "Oh, that's a quote from Proverbs. It doesn't count, right? That's just from Proverbs. That's just a topos. It's just, But now that means that they cared about Proverbs, right? It means that phrase about, the good woman, how that she's defined, is very much pertinent. And it's there's quite a bit in the patristic literature as well. If I were to recommend one book, it would be Derek Kruger's book on liturgical subjects, which is how liturgical poetry about sort of Mary and Adam and Eve shapes the morality of people in the 7th through 10th centuries. Right? So you learn how to be a human by learning how to lament with Mary and with Eve. Right? So you practice articulating the voices of the sinners. These texts, but absolutely, it's upholding structures of power.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from George.
Well, this is half a comment and half a question. First of all, thank you for a brilliant lecture. And now, harkening back to the Byzantine era, we can still see that kind of relation towards females in power in the negotiations between the Serbian king Dusan at the time and Emperor John Cantacuzenos. Of course, in his famous histories, he tells us, well, we were basically in a deadlock, but then came his wife, and he gives this brilliant passage about Queen Helena of Serbia being a great diplomat and just saying, look, you need to sit back down and you need to find an agreement. And ultimately, their conquest of former Byzantine lands and the Byzantine Civil War basically continues of her intervention. But still, he does it in such a brilliant way that it's like, you brought your wife to council. What kind of man are you? Even when you're giving this great position of power and authority to a woman, you're still calling her husband out. You can't do this, but she can. Even though it was John Cantacuzenos that ultimately got the bad end of the bargain, he's just like sitting and writing as a historical source. Maybe I was bad, but I didn't bring my wife to council.
That's a beautiful example. I didn't know that one. I haven't read that in Greek, but it's a beautiful example of the woman in council is another recurring theme. And I think you're absolutely right that the Cantacuzenos is using that to say, well, I might have screwed up everything and lost the war and got the bad end of things, but but he brought his wife in. That's Psellos uses that to explain why when Isaac Komnenos steps down from power, he wants Isaac to look like a good guy. This is 1057. He wants him to look like he's a good emperor, but still have him leave power. So he has his wife come and say, "You've got to cling to power. We need to keep the throne." And she gives this, super power-lusting woman speech, right? Like she's, Cersei Lannister, right? And then everybody says, "Oh, no, no, no." And she's like, "Oh, he has the strength of character to step down anyway." Right. So Psellos constructs him as a strong man, even though he's saying, "Yeah, I'll skip being emperor," by having him stand up to his wife. And that story is playing with Procopius's story of Theodora, where Theodora tells Justinian what to do, and then 40,000 people get murdered in the Hippodrome, right? Which is definitely remembered as a bad story in the 11th and 12th centuries. It keeps coming back. And so basically every time you want an emperor to save face while wimping out, you have them ignore their wife. And I know there's a tradition of feminist historians who really don't like my work because I'm showing that these women these things didn't happen. They're like, "Yeah, strong women. The strong women came in and they told their husbands what to do. And yeah, they were ignored, but they still told their husbands what to do." Like, no, the story about the strong woman is there just to make the guy look strong by ignoring her. So, but thank you for bringing that up, that story. I'll have to check that one out because it's a beautiful example.
There's another moment in Psellos basically defending the legitimacy of the royal line in the 11th century with Empress Zoe Porphyrogenita and rather poor choice of husbands. And it's not her fault. She would be a good emperor, but she fell in love with all the vigor of a discriminated youth, and it's basically referring just to her nature as a woman. He's saying, she'd be a good emperor, but she's a woman. And that did raise some eyebrows. And there's another interesting moment in Procopius' writing, Procopius of Caesarea, in describing the antics of Belisarius, and saying, he's this great general, but then he's being dominated by his wife at home, Antonina, and with her and Theodora basically running the show with everything that is to blame. It's probably the two of them and not Justinian and Belisarius, and the two of the great men doing a great job. So this even has to do with Procopius being a bit sour about the successes and saying, look, you still can't claim that it's down to your masculinity.
Right, exactly. It's Procopius is very commonly read. He's one of the most commonly quoted and alluded to historians. So we get in that classicizing historical writing tradition. So they use that, and his use of gender is something that the medieval Romans are much more attuned to it than the modern scholars. So that we're getting it now, but how he's using the women in order to place the blame where he wants to. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Nemanja had raised his hand previously. Are you still there? I'm afraid he's not. Vidoseva has a question.
Good evening. Unfortunately, I'm currently unable to use the camera, and I apologize for that. I have no questions. I just wanted to thank you for this great and very instructive lecture. It was a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you.
Good evening. Unfortunately, I'm currently...
All right, thank you. Just for the very end, a question that does not have anything to do with gender, but that is on a subject that's very dear to me and where I'm glad that we are in agreement, and that's the inappropriateness of the name Byzantium. And there are many authors who dislike using it, and they use different names instead. And some people say the Eastern Roman Empire, some myself included, say Roman Empire, which is essentially Roman in a Greek spelling, but you use a very interesting phrase that you've used multiple times in this lecture, and that's medieval Romans. And if you could just explain in a few words why you've chosen this name for the country and the people.
Anything that's not Byzantine is better, right? So I think that the main thing is not to use that term, which I think is very tightly bound up in Western supremacy. And I like medieval because so much of my work deals chronologically over the gap. So I talk about classical Romans. I'm also, I think, the only person who talks about classical Roman Empire, because the classicists think it's just the Roman Empire. And I talk about the ancient Greeks. So I have those three time periods, and almost all of my work is tracing things back and forth and understanding the society in terms of those ages. So for me, the chronological time, medieval, seems to be a good pairing. I know that many medievalists are trying to get away from medieval, and it's not great because it's another construct, it's another made-up term. So I think Romania is really good. That's a good one. I think the New Romans is also one that I think the closer we can get to our actual sources and the closer we can get to the society that we're talking about and their terminology, the better. So I think New Romans is very good. That's sometimes perhaps not quite so clear. Eastern Romans, I think, is also okay. I would hope that collectively as a field, different scholars could all wrestle with this. Like, I don't want to have my answer be the only one. I'd like to point out, here, there's a host of problems talking about the Byzantines. But how are you all going to talk about these texts, right? And you want to take Romania, right? What are your reasons? How is that working for you? And I think if we all try it, it's different in different. What's going to work for history of 13th century Jews is going to be different from Egypt. It's going to be different from what's now Greece, right? Different fields and different topics within Byzantine are going to have different solutions. So I hope that we could wrestle with that, and then collectively as a field, we'll have some better terms later. I'm not wedded to medieval by any stretch. But when I'm talking about, when it's Plutarch and George, well, it's 2nd century and it's 12th century, but it's classical and it's medieval. And that's why I talk about the medieval Romans.
Thank you very much. Let's hope we manage to suppress the name Byzantium step by step.
I'm glad you're on board with that. That's great.
Thank you. So if there are no more questions, thanks you once again for this wonderful lecture. Thank you for being our guest, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity once again after the pandemic subsides and you can come to Belgrade again.
That'd be great. Thank you. It'd be wonderful to meet you in person. Thanks so much. Enjoy dinner.
You enjoy lunch.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Napomena za domaću publiku, za sledećeg petka imamo jednu zanimljivu promociju knjige, srpskog izdanja knjige Hazonijeve Velina nacionalizma, i to će biti u hibridnom formatu uživo i online, dakle radit će i dalje ovaj isti link, ali bit će mu i uživo u Amfiteatru 2 ko hoće, tako da imate dve opcije za praćenje. Hvala vam svima na pažnji, prijatno večer.
Svako dobro.